What's up, co-reporters, and welcome back to my channel. We've got to talk about that podcast that Kail launched with Becky. I have to be honest with you, though, I still don't really understand what the point of the podcast is. Similar to how I don't really get what Coffee Convos is about. It seems to be like, two baby mamas talking about like life, co-parenting. They talk about current events. They talk about pop culture. They talk about true crime. It's like any and everything sort of a deal, so I don't really get it, like, the way that baby mamas was very clear, but I digress. So I tuned into today's episode, and it really did live up to the chaos part of the name. Like, straight out the gate, Becky confronts Kail and Lindsay for talking crap about her on the Coffee Convos podcast when the two of them had fallen out. So it turns out that Becky did something similar to what Kail is doing with this podcast, which is that she and Kail were supposed to launch a podcast. Then they didn't launch a podcast, but before, like, they had made an announcement and everything. And Becky created like the feeds and whatnot. So she asked Kail, "Hey, Kail, would you mind if I took these feeds and launched another project I'm working on?" Kail didn't respond, but then she decided to go on Coffee Combos to talk crap about Becky for doing that. And so Kail said that she had some excuses for it, but I didn't hear any like proper excuses. If you guys heard any, please let me know. But it kind of felt like she didn't really have a good reason for going on the air to trash her friend. I think her best defense that she had was, "Well, I didn't use your name." Becky's like, "Listen, you and I both know you were talking about me, girl. Come off it." There was a bit of hostility between the two of them when it came to words. Like, Kail, for someone who claims to read like 7 books a month, for someone who has a communications degree and whatnot, like, she doesn't really seem to be all that well versed in the English language. Like, I feel like she's got a very limited vocabulary. She mispronounces a lot of words or just doesn't know a lot of, rather basic, simple words. And so to me, it really puts all of this alleged reading that she does into question. So for example, at the top of the episode, Becky, she asks Lindsay, "Hey, Lindsay, like, now that you're seeing me and Kail together, like in person, like blah, blah, like kind of like hinting at the chemistry that they have, do you understand the lore about us?" And the lore is that she and Kail were dating. Kail and Becky used to pretend that they were dating back in the day when Kail was pregnant with a Lux, because she didn't want that info out there that she was pregnant with Lux. So she did this as kind of like, a distraction. And so Kayla's like, "Wow, Becky, you're like making up words to like make yourself sound smart. Like, what is that lore?" I'm like, "Girl, how do you not know what lore means? Like, this is like the year of that word being used so often, similar to the word era. So I found it very odd that she didn't know what this means. And again, like I'm saying, like, this girl, she's telling us that she reads like 50 books a year. Well, let me see, like, how many words are in these books. Are they picture books? Because it's starting to look that way, babe. I have to say, by the way, that Becky asking that question was rather disrespectful to her wife, to be honest. And I kind of get this vibe with this. Sometimes I feel like people are this way when it comes to especially lesbian relationships. Like, I feel like they get taken less seriously than other relationships, and I really hate that for my girls. Like, just, oh, like, you're a married woman and you're like, "Hey, like, do you see like the chemistry I have with this other one where people thought we were in love?" Like, what is that? Your wife is at home, pregnant with your baby, and this is what you're out here on a podcast doing, sis? Like, it's weird to me anyway. And then what happens next, you guys? So Kail would actually like kind of cut Becky off here and there during the recording when they were talking to, which Becky would be asking Lindsay questions. But in Kail's defense, Becky's not good at asking questions. She jumped around, like, she didn't set the stage, for these questions to be asked properly. There was even a point where she told Lindsay that she literally didn't care because Lindsay was like explaining how her relationship with like her siblings and how, why she feels so estranged from them. And then Becky is like, "Listen, I don't really care about these relationships. I just want to know like about the grief." Like, Becky was all about picking Lindsay apart to figure out what makes her sad, what makes her grieve, her traumas. And she, it just felt very much like, sis, you are not a mental health professional. This is not a grief podcast. Like, this is not you know what I mean? This is not the way, in my humble opinion, to be getting that kind of info. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like if that's your friend, okay, ask questions. But like, you're just meeting this girl. You didn't even do any research about her or anything to know like what to stay away from, this, that, and the other. And you're just out here like, "Hey, here's the mic. Let's talk about you being sad." I didn't love that. I really have to be honest with you guys. And so I do think that sometimes Kail was trying to like steer the conversation in a different direction, which I did appreciate as a listener, because it was just a very miserable episode, to be, to be quite frank. Again, I do believe that Becky could have done some at least basic research. Listen, you're running a podcast as a business. Like, you really have to show up as a professional. You can't just sit there and be like, oh, well, I've never watched your show. Well, okay, well, do some research on the show so that you know what types of questions to ask instead of just asking, the most basic things that like you're the typical listener of this podcast already knows, because it just comes across as rather stupid. Then let's talk about how the wife was disrespected yet again, shall we? Now, at this point, Lindsay's talking about all the different hats she wears in her life, right? As a daughter, as a mother, and then she says as a sometimes girlfriend, and then Kail quips as Becky's girlfriend. And so Lindsay goes, yeah, as sometimes as Becky's girlfriend, sometimes as other people's girlfriends. And then I was like, oof, not y'all disrespecting the wife again. But listen, Becky, you low-key opened the door up for this when you did that other thing earlier. We were like, Lindsay, do you see why people think Kail and I are attracted to each other? Ha ha, And so Becky, she goes, hey, can you guys clip that part out? Guess what part was not clipped out? That part. So, it did make me kind of like disappointed for the wifey. I'd be pissed, to be honest with you, if like my man was out here thought and bopping on podcasts, having these kinds of conversations with like other women. I'd be like, absolutely effing not. Like, no. Especially if you're at home pregnant, Now let's get into another illiterate debate, right? So later on, like towards the end of the podcast episode, Becky talks about unironically being like a hopeless romantic. And so Kail is like, what does that mean, unironically? Like, why do you keep making up words? I'm like, Kail, when are you going to be honest about the fact that you don't read? Because there's no way you are a well-read person and you don't know what the word unironically means. You don't know what the word lore means. Like, where have you been? Again, are these Robert Munch books you're reading? Because the math is just not mathing, sis. And you expose yourself every time. And it's not even just in this podcast episode, but like, you guys are already aware that I recap her podcasts, like all of them, for my channel members every week. So I'm listening to her constantly, not knowing the simplest of words. And I just, I'm rather stunned by it, to be quite honest with you. But anyway, now at this point, Becky calls her out. She's like, Kail, why do you keep accusing me of like making up words? These are real words that I'm using. Like, I would be irritated too that like, sorry, but a moron is accusing me of making up words just because I'm using 6th grade words. These are not even like, crazy like words that like people use to sound pompous and arrogant. These are basic words that children know, So yeah, Becky was definitely getting irritated at that point. And then Kail's, she kind of jokingly says, well, listen, like when I mispronounced indicted as indicted, that went viral and I got trolled all over the internet. And I want someone else to suffer the way I suffered, which I thought was rather funny. And then later on, like Becky just goes back to asking Lindsay a bunch of questions about like her traumatic childhood and like heartbreak about like the dissolution of her relationship with her parents and like not having a relationship with her siblings, the divorce, childhood trauma. And, again, a couple questions here and there. Okay. But when you were just hounding on it for a solid hour, and you're not some kind of a mental health professional, this is not like a podcast specifically geared towards grief, as far as I'm aware anyway. It felt like a bit much. It felt a bit heavy. So at the end, they decided to lighten up the mood by playing F, Marry, Kill. They had asked their fans on social media to play F, Marry, Kill with the 3 of them. So Lindsay, Kail, and Becky, which ladies, we're all in our 30s. Like, are we really still playing this game? Okay. Especially on the podcast? Sure. And then, so like there was a mix depending on who was asking their audience. Obviously, your audience is never going to off you, right? So it was just kind of like a childish game, but I digress. And then later on, I think it was Kail who suggested they do or maybe it was Lindsay, FMK with their ex-husbands. And so it was like, oh, like, is it Javi? Is it Will? Or is it, and who was the third one? I forgot who the third one was. Yeah. And so like the girls pretty much all said that they would marry Lindsay's ex-husband, Will. And then the other 2 that they would off. And I believe, yeah, maybe they said they used Javi and Chris or something like that. But anyway, yeah, weird vibes, to be honest with you. I'm not sure. I really do think that Becky needs to kind of take a step back when it comes to the way she speaks about other women and stuff and the jokes she makes. I do think that that can be rather upsetting to her wife. I'm seeing a flirty vibe here that I personally would not appreciate. And yeah, I wonder how her wife is going to feel about all this, if she is paying attention to this podcast at all. I'm sure she's got other things going on, but that was just something that kind of like, piqued my interest a little bit because I don't know. I feel like these things, like, I don't know. Sometimes I really do feel like people kind of take the piss when it comes to lesbian relationships, when like boundaries get crossed so easily because like the gravity of them is just not really recognized the same way that the gravity of heterosexual relationships is recognized, or the gravity of like gay male relationships. Does anyone else feel that way, or am I reaching? Anyway, you guys, if you enjoyed this recap, do make sure to give it a thumbs up. And also, if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on a single video moving forward. That's all for now. Thank you so much for watching and have a great week.